where God and earth meet. And he's out near the holy mountain, and something attracts his attention. And he goes off the beaten path to investigate. Okay, so that's the first thing, that's the first bit of wisdom to derive from the story. You'll have your role, and you should have your role as a socialized adult, right? So you're kind of a type that way. You're maybe even a cookie cutter type, but you've adopted this mature social role. It doesn't make you a full individual, but it's better than being immature and staying in your father's tent, for example, which is what Abraham does until he's very old. So something attracts Moses' attention, and he goes off to investigate. Okay, so, and then he sees that it's a burning bush. And so what's a burning bush? Well, it's the tree of life, and life is often represented as a branching tree. And it's on fire because it's compelling, because fire is compelling. And fire is alive, and it's a symbol of life because everything that is alive burns. That's what metabolism is. And so a burning bush is like life itself intensified to the ultimate degree, and that's what attracts Moses' attention. And he gets closer and closer to it, which means he investigates more and more deeply. And as he investigates more deeply, he starts to understand that he's nearing the depths. He's on sacred ground. He takes off his shoes, and that's an indication of his willingness to transform in identity. And he continues to investigate, and then the voice of being itself speaks to him from the depths, and it tells him that it reveals itself to him as the ground of being itself, and it transforms him into the leader who invites his people away from slavery and who stands up against tyranny. And so that's the story of Moses' baptism. And so what does that mean for the ordinary person? You need to mature. You need to become an adult. You need to be a good man in your time. But then you have to pay attention to see what attracts your attention, what calls to you, because there's an autonomy about that, right? You don't get to pick what interests you. It picks you. And you can respond to that call and investigate or reject it. Those are your options. And if you reject it, you stay in your box. But if you follow it, something will call to you. And then if you investigate that, that will transform you. And if you investigate it deeply enough, it'll transform you into the person who can stand up against tyranny and who can lead his people away from slavery. And that's how God is defined in that story. God is the thing that calls to you to take you out of your role, that will shape the manner in which your psyche transforms itself as a consequence of your diligent investigation into what calls to you. And so that's the God that's portrayed. That's one image of the God that's portrayed in the Old Testament. And so you move out of the tyranny. That's what happens, let's say, in the throes of a psychedelic experience, is that the preconceptions are shattered. Now you're somewhere unstructured. Okay, well, you can't worship what's unstructured. You have to find the proper structuring for your new freedom. The vision that's put forward in the book of Exodus is a vision of multidimensional, responsible identity. So you take on responsibility for your own life. You take on responsibility for the life of your wife or your husband. You take on responsibility for your family. You're a model for your community. You serve your state. You do what you can for your nation, and that's all united under your highest upward orientation. And that's ordered freedom. That's ordered freedom. It's not the same as the hedonistic freedom that the people like Nixon and the sort of right-wing conservatives of the 1960s were terrified by, that kind of hedonistic anarchy. It's the same thing with the broader community. It all stacks up musically. And so then mental health doesn't become how your psyche is organized internally, which is what the clinical psychologists misled people into believing. It's more like the harmony that obtains from the psyche upward through society when everything is stacked up properly to the up to the highest level possible of being. And that's another definition of God. So one of the things I tried to do in this book is to actually define what it is that we're arguing about. Because the old man in the sky superstition doesn't cover the territory. So for example, if you look at God in the story of Abraham and you say, do you believe in that God? What you're asking, even though you might not know it, is, do you believe that there is a call to adventure, and that following that call will not only integrate you, but serve society in the highest possible manner. And that, well, it's still a problem now to some degree, because people who are pursuing, let's say, nonconformist freedom don't understand that the replacement for freedom isn't hedonistic anarchy. And that's partly because it's self-defeating. It's also pointless. It's also pointless and meaningless. And it's partly pointless and meaningless because imagine, and this is part of the implication of the story of Abraham, is that the instinct of meaning comes to you when you pursue a pathway that specifies, what would you say, the limitless development of your integrated psyche. But it's not just the psyche, it's the integration of the psyche with all the different levels of society. Like, for example, insofar as you're well put together, you're going to be a highly functional husband to your wife, right? Like, your own psychological organization, integration, cannot be divorced from the union that you make with your wife. They're the same thing. And then you can extend that to your kids. Like, for example, insofar as you're well put together, you're going to be a highly functional husband to your wife, right? Like, your own psychological organization, integration, cannot be divorced from the union that you make with your wife. They're the same thing. And then you can extend that to your kids. For you to get your act together means simultaneously that you establish the proper relationship with your wife and with your children. Those are the same thing. And then if you can manage that, you do the same thing with the broader community. It all stacks up musically. And so then mental health doesn't become how your psyche is organized internally, which is what the clinical psychologists misled people into believing. It's more like the harmony that obtains from the psyche upward through society when everything is stacked up properly to the up to the highest level possible of being. And that's another definition of God. So one of the things, by the way, as well. So what this story does is it takes the call to adventure, which is the instinct that makes children move out into the world. It's the spirit that you encourage if you're a good father. It lines that up and it says, if you follow that and let it pull you out of your zone of comfort, your life will be a blessing to you. Your reputation will grow. You'll establish something permanent, and you'll do that in a way that's good for everyone, right? So that's a hell of a good deal. And that's the story of Abraham. Okay, so why is that relevant to the psychedelic debate? Because if you're going to move into the zone of the transcendent, you have to take on the requisite responsibility, or the process of transcendence turns into something like a descent into unstructured chaos. And that's not an improvement. It's just a movement from tyranny into the desert. That's a good way of thinking about it symbolically. So what happens in as the call to adventure. And that's a very useful thing to know. So in the Moses story, God comes to Moses as that which attracts his interest and takes him off the beaten path. In the story of Abraham, God comes as the spirit of adventure. And God makes Abraham a deal. It's a very specific deal, and it's the best possible deal. This is the covenant, by the way. This is the covenant. So God tells Abraham, if you leave your zone of comfort, if you remove yourself from your father's tent, if you move away from infantile materialistic satiation and go out into the terrible world, and you do that voluntarily, you have the adventure of your life, this is what will happen. You'll be a blessing to yourself that's genuine. So instead of being racked with self-doubt and being self-conscious and taking yourself apart with guilt and shame, you'll ride the wave of adventure and you'll feel that your life is a blessing. Not only will you feel that, it will be a blessing. That's the first thing that will happen. So you'll stand out among your peers, but in a justifiable manner that's a consequence of your own intrinsic merit. The third thing that'll happen is that you'll have the opportunity to establish something permanent. For Abraham, it's a dynasty, right? He's offered the possibility of being the father of nations. And the fourth thing that happens is you'll do it in a way that's of cardinal benefit to everyone. And so what happens in that story, this is so cool. It's so remarkable. It's the answer to the selfish gene, by the way, as well. So what this story does is it takes the call to adventure, which is the instinct that makes children move out into the world. It's the spirit that you encourage if you're a good father. It lines that up and it says if you follow that and let it pull you out of your zone of comfort, your life will be a blessing to you. Your reputation will grow. You'll establish something permanent, and you'll do that in a way that's good for everyone. Right? So that's a hell of a good deal. And that's the story of Abraham.